Planet X Games is back and bringing the heat with an all-new fourth installment of The Phylactery, launching March 1st and running through March 22nd on Kickstarter. This all-new issue of The Phylactery is bigger, badder, and louder in every way, with the same heart and feel of old-school fantasy RPGs we grew up playing. The Phylactery is loaded from cover to cover with quick and easy resources like NPCs, plot hooks, and weapons for use directly at your gaming table. There is no fluff in here, nothing padding out the page count. The Phylactery 4 is all killer, no filler, and this time it's brought a friend to the dance. On March 1st, Planet X Games is also launching the Phylactery Omnibus, celebrating the 4th year of putting the grind back in Grindhouse. This omnibus collects the Phylactery 1 through 4 and includes over 50 pages of all new, never-before-seen content. This big old boy is perfect for that plug-and-play, straight-to-the-table experience the original issues are known for. So if you're looking for a party that's all OSR all the time, Planet X has got you covered. Check out the Phylactery and the Phylactery Omnibus, running from March 1st to March 22nd on Kickstarter. All great adventures start somewhere. This time it all starts with a chicken. Running now through Thursday, April the 8th on Kickstarter, Frog God Games returns to one of its very first adventures, Splinters of Faith, now expanded and updated for 5th edition and Swords and Sorcery. This all-new volume contains a series of 7 linked adventures, centering on stopping the return of the dread death priest Akoral Rathamon and his undead minions. The Splinters of Faith campaign offers dozens of unique temples to explore, handouts for the players, new monsters, magic items, and so much more. Splinters of Faith also includes an additional adventure, postcards, journals, and maps, all put into one book, all at the GM's fingertips. Will your heroes be able to restore the Scepter of Faiths and defeat Akoral Rathamon once and for all? Check out Splinters of Faith, running now through Thursday, April 8th, on Kickstarter.
This is the Vintage RPG Podcast, your source for the best in classic and contemporary RPGs. With your hosts, Hambone and Stu.
Welcome to the Vintage RPG Podcast, coming at you again from the clubhouse, hidden somewhere in the swamps of New Jersey. I'm John Hambone McGuire, and with me, as always, is the founder and publisher of Unwinnable. Today, he wants to talk about Glorantha, Glorantha. It was a long way to go for the joke, and I feel like I nailed it. Stu Horvath.
Yeah, we're gonna do. We're gonna, I don't just gotta like. Hold on, I need to take a breath.
Yeah, I was like, how in the hell am I gonna come up with a joke for Glorantha? And you know what? I would listen to this like punk playlist, like classic punk playlist on my phone, and Patti Smith group keeps coming up. So I've heard that glorious song like 14 times in the last like 6 days, and so here's to you, Patti Smith.
Yeah.
So Stu, Glorantha, I guess this is like part 2 of RuneQuest?
Yeah, so we kind of scratched the surface of the RuneQuest system a couple weeks ago, and I'm going to try and give you like an overview of Glorantha. I have to start by saying that I'm probably going to do like an job because it's such a big job. Really hard to talk about Glorantha. And for instance, the Glorantha guide is this 2 oversized books in a slipcase. It's like 4 inches deep, like 1,000 pages. There's a lot of material that makes up Glorantha, and it's hard to kind of distill down because it's a really complex fantasy world, and it lacks a lot of the touchstones that we've come to sort of associate with role-playing fantasy. Like there's not really a lot of Tolkien influence, and there's a lot of sort of trippy stuff that is built into the system. That it's a much different vibe than what you're used to, especially if you're coming from D&D.
You know, you've always kind of described it to me as a little more experimental than the traditional RPG, you know, because there was more vibe to it where you're looking at the world through a very different lens than you are the general, okay, we wake up, we're like a dirtbag adventurer, we're going to go kill some stuff, call it a day.
Yeah, and I think experimental is a really good word because there's sort of a drug connotation with the word experimental, right? And I think that there is sort of like a drugginess to the world build, because so Greg Stafford was really into shamanism and mythology generally. That's why Glorantha exists. He was trying to kind of build a thought experiment that could help him kind of understand the intricacies and connections between world mythologies, which is like, okay, good on you, Greg. Like, that's a really interesting and heady side project, mental exercise. But he was also interested in shamanism, and there's a lot of that kind of idea. You know, we talked a little bit about it when we talked to Gamma Valley about Caramundus, about like the transcendental experiences that you can have with like magic mushrooms and stuff, and how that informs a lot of like mythology and mysticism. So a lot of that's baked in. So I think the best way to start is to kind of start from Dungeons and Dragons. I do this a lot, and I feel like folks think I'm banging on Dungeons and Dragons. I'm not, but it is really the one that everyone's played, so it's a good starting point.
I mean, it's the touchstone of every RPG ever.
Yeah.
You know, it is like, if you look at the thing that launched 1,000 ships, it's Dungeons and Dragons. And I think that, you know, I know we chat with people in Discord about this, and they get a little sassy about, you know, our takes on Dungeons and Dragons, mostly more yours than mine. But, you know, in the end of the day, like, from a critical lens, you can't help but draw that line straight back to Dungeons and Dragons. And every one of those lines finds its way back to D&D eventually. So here we are.
Yeah. So D&D kind of functions on a single axis, right? It's really about your personal story, right? Your character, you embodied by your character, where you go into a hole in the ground and you find, you know, glory and riches, and then you find another hole in the ground and more glory and riches. And it's all about your personal enrichment as a character, right? This is baked into the rules. This is what the rules are telling you to do with the game. This is the thrust of the game. And implied by those rules is maybe later on like a social axis and a political axis, which is like, social is like your community. So like maybe your characters live in a town. That totally didn't exist in original Dungeons and Dragons. It was literally just dungeon crawl. But over time, you know, there's at least an implication that towns exist in the worlds of Dungeons and Dragons. With towns comes like larger political factions. So like you start seeing like what you would call like faction crawls and things like Bar and stuff. Neither the social nor the political are very baked into the system itself. There's nothing mechanical that says D&D has to interact with those things. Mechanically, Dungeons and Dragons, especially at inception, is about going into holes in the ground, killing monsters, taking their loot.
Rinse, repeat.
Yeah, and nothing wrong with that. RuneQuest, in the rules, baked into the rules, it works with all three of those axes. You have your personal drives. You want to be better at things. You want to learn magic. You want to be rich. You want to have, you know, be powerful, just like D&D, you know, and that's probably going to involve going into holes, killing monsters, taking treasure. But through the way the magic system works, there's an automatic social component. We talked about this in the RuneQuest episode, where like the more power you get magically, you get it through being a member of the cult, and the cult is a part of the community and has a community function. So like part of the rules of the game depends on this social function. And just because of the richness of the world and the connection of the world to the game, there's a built-in political function. You know, a lot of the tension of the game comes from this clash of cultures between barbarians of Dragon Pass and the Lunar Empire, and the Lunar Empire and the tribes of Prax. And there's like colonialism and imperialism and revolution and rebellion and all of these things. Those are built in. The mythology of the social fuels the machinations of the political. It's all connected, and it's all really sort of explicit in the rules. Mechanically, that's very different from D&D. And like D&D, it implies another kind of game that can be played. You know, where like D&D implies the social and the political, Glorantha implies the mythic. Okay, and this is where Glorantha gets like, what?
Well, there's always that lingering world in D&D, and that's really more often than not what it does, especially with like later era D&D, I think, where like you are knowing that there are other things at play and other things going on in the world there is politics going on. There is, colonialism. There is all those other isms happening. But mostly your prime function is still walking and killing.
Yep.
You are more or less in a 2D side scroll. You're walking in a straight line. You are killing stuff, rinse, repeat. I love it. Me, big fan. However, I can understand how others may want a little more, something a little deeper, a little richer, but also not a movie about a trade war. And it sounds like, when you're leaning more into the mythic of it, and that you're acknowledging and having to interact with the other things that are happening in the world around you, that's where this kind of Glorantha tapestry is kind of coming together.
Yeah. So it's like mind blowing to me because so Glorantha has a rich religion. Glorantha has a rich mythology, and it's not just one mythology. There's bunches of pantheons. They all have different histories. Different culture groups hold those gods in different forms. So which is really kind of like, real world mythology, like with the Greeks or the Romans. It's like they aren't the same gods. They are very different in a lot of ways, but you could also see the similarities and how they might be coming down from one true Zeus that's sort of filtered through cultural things. And a lot of that's at play here. There's a lot of history, and all of these things sort of are just baked into the system. But to sort of get a better idea of how the mythic plays into the RuneQuest and any kind of role playing in Glorantha, you have to kind of take a look back at the cosmology of Glorantha. So I'm going to start talking about time, and this is going to hurt everybody's head. Most Glorantha books, RuneQuest books that deal with the world begin with sort of an explanation of time. Time is a recent development in creation. It's the result of a truce that was made between the gods, all of them. Basically, in the time of myth, which is called God time, there was no time. It existed in sort of like this weird primal stasis, which doesn't make any sense. It's really hard to conceive of because we are creatures of time. So it's hard to it's a naturally difficult thing to conceive of. But all myth takes place in this God time before time. And gods being gods were pretty petty, and they got up to some nonsense, and they fought amongst each other, and there were conspiracies, and the pantheons didn't get along, and some gods got murdered, and this, that, and the other thing. And all of their silliness puts cracks in reality that let chaos seep into the world.
That's awesome.
Yeah, those cracks, chaos invading is bad. Chaos is basically the opposite of creation in Glorantha's cosmology. So basically, like chaos wants to unmake reality so that there's just void. And obviously, people living in reality are kind of like, oh, I kind of like reality. It kind of sucks, but it's kind of cool too. So maybe not with the chaos. So the gods band together. There's a big war between the gods and chaos. They eke out a victory. They seal chaos away. And the only way they can ensure that everything's going to be cool going forward is if they have this truce and they enter into this sort of stasis, which is time, and let the mortal world kind of go on its own. And the mortal world is not all that old. The mortal world is also square and floating on a vast ocean. It's weird.
What?
Yeah, I know, it's weird. It's like a lozenge. It's like a rectangular lozenge, and like it just floats in this vast ocean.
Oh, so it's not like a traditional idea of what the flat Earth is. It's kind of like an island.
Yeah, kind of.
All right. I mean, was this guy reading like Terry Pratchett beforehand, or is this like?
I think this is before Terry Pratchett. I think that part of it is just like he wanted it to be as odd a world structure as possible, so that like it would just shake you out of preconceived notions about what is supposed to go on. If it was a globe with like landscape that is familiar to us, we're going to sort of think in familiar modes, right? And I think that the idea was to shake out of that and reconfigure things in a way that would bring new meaning and understanding. And you can see that in the way that, especially in the modern stuff, they have some really great artists, that the gods are these really interesting amalgamations of real world kind of imagery, so that like Orlanth is storm god of the barbarians of Dragon Pass. And like, you think, okay, well, that's going to be like Thor. but they don't go that way. Like they there's a lot of Persian influence, a lot of South Asian influence in the art. So like you get these interesting amalgamations of the godhead as like he's blue and he's got 4 arms, and so he's a storm god, and you still kind of recognize him as like the storm god of the Indo-European tradition, but he's also like different. And because he's sort of free of like, well, Zeus would do this, the stories can kind of go in different directions. If that makes sense.
It absolutely does. And, the more you learn about different cultures, you see the commonality in the way that they treated the old gods, and the way that, everyone has that story, except it's variations on a theme. So as people who have grown up in the Mighty Marvel tradition, we have a very specific thought of what Thor, the god of thunder, is. However, in many other cultures, they have a different idea about it, but similar concept. And I think that's pretty cool. I think it's a very cool way to address that and get people like psyched on something that may not be, Chris Hemsworth.
Yeah, and it's a way to kind of just like to reinterpret everything. This goes even farther because original RuneQuest didn't really have this, and rules for it and the ability to play it only came around with HeroQuest, which was not the Milton Bradley Games Workshop board game. But after the trademark on that lapsed, Stafford snapped it up and built sort of a narrative storytelling RPG out of it for RuneQuest. But the word HeroQuest is really important from the very beginning. There just weren't rules for hero questing until more recent iterations of the game. Hero questing is the term used for when, say, a bunch of powerful people, like a party of player characters, performs a ceremony at a particular time with using particular substances and projects themselves into the god time and take the roles of mythological figures in, a particular scenario from myth in order to learn something or get something for the matters at hand in their community. You might revisit like a battle in the God War because you need a weapon to use against the cattle rustlers who are like stealing your cows, right? So you go into the myth. Are you following me?
I'm following you, and I'm thinking this is a bunch of dudes sitting around in a basement with some polyhedral dice and LSD having a real wild time.
Well, see, like it's kind of cool because it works as like a meta, like commentary on role playing. It's really early for this kind of idea, but yeah, you're playing characters in a world who are basically using like ritual thinking to project themselves into a role playing game of myth so that they can get stuff. It's really weird. And the cool thing about it is that because you're projecting into the god time and there's a sort of stasis, and everything that happens in the god time, everything happens. That all potential outcomes are there because time doesn't exist, right? So like it's not like it doesn't function the same way. So you can go into a myth and change the outcome because you're looking for something else, right? So like the god in the story has to choose between a shield and a sword during the course of the story. And like the accepted myth is that he chooses the sword and leads the clan to battle and victory. But you need something defensive. You can change the story so that you get the shield and pull that shield out of the myth time into the real world and use it for your own purposes.
So basically a Nightmare on Elm Street 3.
Yeah, kinda.
I'm loving this.
Except like tied up with like really weird fantasy myth. It's really strange.
So what year was this?
Late 70s, early 80s. But again, like Stafford envisioned the idea of hero questing is there. It's talked about, but it's never explicitly laid out as like a rule system for how to do it. And he wanted to release like sort of a different game for that, which was HeroQuest that comes out in 2000. And there is functionality for it in RuneQuest 7 now. But even with that functionality, you kind of need to have like this grounding in the myths of Glorantha to be able to kind of leverage that. I think that it's super fascinating, but I also find it extremely daunting to like put it into play because it requires a sort of immersion on the level of the players that like that you got to all work really hard to get there.
It has to be rewarding, like, because if you are playing with a group who is that willing to immerse themselves and committed to really being a part of the story, because let's face it, most players, myself included, are walking and killing stuff, or like wanting to blow stuff up, or like trying to find like goofy ways to like recreate the snow speeder scene with the giant in like Dungeons and Dragons or Dungeon Crawl Classic. Like, it takes a very specific kind of player to want to sit down at the table and have this experience. And kudos to them. Whatever role playing experience you're going for is the right one for you. And I think that's awesome. However, you're not going to just get your general adventuring party around the table willing to do something like this, because it will take work, but you put in the time, you get to have cake at the end. And like, that's the reward.
It's a very different sort of game, and even like games that have really rich meta narratives like Vampire the Masquerade, where there's a lot of lore. The game itself isn't about exploring that lore. The lore is there for your own entertainment. It's for people like me who just like to read role-playing books. Glorantha and RuneQuest is about exploring that lore. So if you don't vibe on this weird non-Tolkien Bronze Age mythic role-playing world, where the point is exploring the different facets of the world, both like manifest in reality and in, myth, you're not going to be into the game like at all.
Yeah.
So like baseline, like you probably could get by for a while, just killing monsters and stuff. But really the richness of the game is the world and inhabiting it and exploring it and learning about it together. And it doesn't have to be right. I want to like back off a little bit from my idea that like you need to have like this grounding in mythology, like this fictional mythology, to really sell the game. You don't, because they've stressed from the very beginning that your Glorantha may vary. And it's sort of like the famous quote dealing with Glorantha is that it's going to be different at every table you go to. And that's cool. That's freeing in a way. I just find it daunting because like my brain wants to put it all together and like do it right. And like, that's like a me problem. I think that might be like a broader dungeon master, game master syndrome. Like, I think that folks who like to run games kind of might think along the way my brain works. But I mean, obviously people have been playing RuneQuest for years, and it was one of the primary rivals to D&D's throne early on.
Yeah. I mean, it's awesome. I mean, everything you're telling me about it is awesome. And the more we do this show, the more I hear about all these awesome games and all these awesome concepts. And this is a very high concept comparative to your standard dungeon crawl. And I think that's dope. I think also, knowing you and playing games with you for almost like 2 decades at this point, you are probably one of the few dungeon masters that I know who could make something like this work, because you are used to the long con. We did the 12-year campaign. We did like 2 years on like, Call of Cthulhu. Like, it's not going to happen overnight. And I think that there is something that is got to be very rewarding about getting into something like this, because I know from my own experience how rewarding it felt to be at the end of a long campaign and be like, shit, we did that.
Yeah. And these big stories that unfold that give you meaning in your own life. Because like the nice thing about hooking your story into all these social, political, and mythological things is that it's inevitably going to tell you stuff about the world you live in and the way you live it. That's cool. Like, I love D&D, but I'm never going to be in a hole fighting monsters for treasure. I'm just not. It's just not going to happen. I'm not built that way, Hambone.
That's my job.
But there is sort of like a potential for a game that's sort of structured like this to really kind of change your thinking about stuff, I think.
Well, very cool. I know my final thought on this is that we are not encouraging anyone to microdose LSD and play Dungeons and Dragons or RuneQuest or any RPG. But nonetheless, playing games like this are great for expanding your mind in other ways. Stu, do you have any final thoughts on Glorantha?
My final thought is that I'm still really just scratching at the surface, man. We didn't even get to the Lunar Empire and how they think that chaos is kind of cool, actually. There's just so much. We could start a whole different podcast about RuneQuest and just have weekly episodes about RuneQuest for years, and it'd be fine. I don't know if anybody wants to hear that. I don't want to do that, really. This isn't like me demoing like a backdoor pilot. Like, I'm just saying there's a lot there. We'll probably keep coming back to it periodically, but you got between the RuneQuest mechanics episode a couple weeks ago and this one that sort of is a broad overview of the world and the mythology. I think that you have if you like what you hear, you could dive right into the current line of books from Chaosium, and you'll be excited and happy.
Yeah. I mean, we love doing the show and we continue to do the show, and we do smaller episodes. So that Glorantha thing that Stu was just talking about is not really for us, but it's like, the centerpiece at a wedding. Not everyone wants to take it, but whoever does is really going to enjoy it. So we're just going to put that idea out there in the universe. You could take it off the table, take it home with you. And this was another amazing episode of the Vintage RPG podcast. Stu, where can the people find you online?
They can find me on Instagram at Vintage RPG. I don't have any RuneQuest posts this year, but I will definitely change that for next year.
Well, very cool. You can find me across social media at John McGuire RPG on Instagram, on Twitter, and on the TikTok. I will not be dancing, but I've got some other fun RPG ideas that I'm going to start doing soon since I got my haircut and I look cute again. You could also find my books over at Exalted Funeral, 321 Action. We've got a cool adventure over there, and you're going to shop there anyway, so why not stop by and pick up your old buddy HB's adventure. You can also check us out on Patreon, patreon.com/vintagerpg. We got a behind-the-scenes look at Stu's book, still tentatively titled Experience Points. We got a behind-the-scenes look at the things I do with 321 Action. We got a killer Discord community, early release episodes, and more. Patreon.com/vintagerpg. And don't forget, if you like the podcast, please rate, review, and subscribe, because your reviews really do help other listeners to find us. So for Stu Horvath, I'm John Hambone McGuire. May the dice always roll in your favor.
Thanks for listening. Don't forget to like, review, and subscribe to the podcast. Every review helps other listeners to find us. The Vintage RPG Podcast is a ham-fisted production. Music by Dega West. Art by Schaefer Brown. If you like the podcast, you should also consider becoming a patron at patreon.com.